Welcome to Felony Miami, where we have real conversations with real people about the criminal justice system right here in America.
Well, it's early in the morning, when I ride, Lordy Mama. Well, it's early in the morning, when I ride. Well, it's early in the morning, baby, when I ride, baby. Help me, help me, help me, my right side.
Private prisons are the scourge of civilization. The food is awful, the water tastes like it came from a gutter in Flint, Michigan, and sending an email cost more than a Rolls-Royce lease payment. It took Americans from 1776 till 1986 to lock up its first 1 million fellow citizens. Some needed to be put away, that's for sure. But from 1986 till 2006, it locked up another 1.5 million, giving the USA the #1 spot for the most citizens caged. Everything about prison equals misery, and some say it should be. But private prisons take the cake, and the corruption there is at a whole other level. Private prison lobbyists play American politicians like cheap fiddles. And that's why our country has the highest incarceration rate in the world. The fake news is complicit, and the real news has such low standards for the truth that what really is going on the front page is never what's really going on the front page. Thanks to greed and false intentions and we don't care attitude, nowadays modern slavery is perpetuated via a simple campaign contribution to both sides. And where there isn't justice for one, there isn't justice for all. Welcome to Felony Miami. Let's air it out. Hello and welcome back to Felony Miami. I'm your host, Joe Stone, and on today's program we have three guests. To my right, we have Kristy Figueroa Contreras, Florida Bar Board Certified Specialist in Immigration and Nationality Law, Florida and federal criminal trial attorney, representing clients in all 50 states, wow, and worldwide. Attorney Kristy Figueroa practices exclusively in all aspects of U.S. immigration, nationality, and what is this? Consular law? What's that?
Consular law, consulates.
Oh, it's with consulates. Mm-hmm. Really?
U.S. embassies and consulates,
oh, wow.
right?
Okay. See, we're taking Felony Miami to another level, people. This is where we're at. And the criminal defense of persons accused of a wide range of Florida and federal felonies and misdemeanor offenses. Wow, that's a mouthful. Her criminal trial experience makes her particularly well-versed in the complex and ever-changing interplay between criminal law and immigration law and procedures. Wow, and that's a hot topic right now, so I definitely want to get your opinion on some of those things. Directly across from me is Mr. Paul Wright. Paul Wright is the founder and executive director of the Human Rights Defense Center. He's also editor of Prison Legal News, the PLN, the longest-running independent prisoner rights publication in the United States. His articles have appeared in over 80 publications, ranging from The Counterpunch to USA Today. Former prisoner, Paul was imprisoned for 17 years in Washington State until his release in 2003. During and since his incarceration, he has successfully litigated a wide variety of censorship and public records cases against prison systems around the country, both as a pro se plaintiff and on behalf of PLM. And for those of you who don't know, pro se plaintiff means on your own, right?
Right, representing yourself.
Representing yourself. Okay, and to my left, Jerry Ianelli. Jerry Ianelli is a Miami New Times daily reporter. He earned his master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. Told you we're taking things to another level here. He moved to South Florida in 2015, and he covers civil rights and political corruption across South Florida. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
That's a nice panel of guests we have today. So before the show, we were we were starting to talk about some immigration stuff and different laws, and Kristy was going off on some stuff, and I was like, stop! We want to hear your story when we get on the air. So I want to let you jump into that story, and then I have questions for everybody, but I want to let you tell us what's going on.
Well, we were talking about different treatment that certain people get from police officers. And the other day, I was parked late at night in a kind of sketchy area in downtown Miami. So I, got in my car and left. And I hadn't noticed, but my license plate was stolen. So I got pulled over by, I was driving through Little Havana. I got pulled over by a city of Miami police officer. He's like, hey, where's your license plate? I'm like, what are you talking about? I got out of my car, no problem. Like, I don't know what happened to it. Officer did not even ask me for my driver's license. Okay, well, for people that don't know, I'm a very fair-skinned Hispanic woman.
She's a white girl.
White girl. And didn't even ask me for my driver's license, let me go. Drove, about a mile up the road, got pulled over a second time. Officer number 2, same thing. Hey, what's up? Making jokes with me. Did not ask me for my driver's license. Let me go. Finally, I'm out, Coral Gables, got pulled over a third time. And I was just so sick of not getting asked for my driver's license. I pulled out my driver's license and I said, hey. And, they let me go home. And I say, had I been a darker shade of skin, I know that my treatment would not have been the same.
Yeah. I think
I
guess the conversation was white privilege, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it exists.
So,
no question. No question about it. I want to get into some of the stuff that's going on with families being detained, and I know you know a bit about that, but I want to jump real quick into something that's been a burning issue for me and for the listeners of this program, and I want to ask this from you, Paul. Private prisons fundamentally just seems wrong.
Yeah, and it is. And what's funny, though, is that the United States had a big experiment with private prisons back over 100 years ago, and a lot of prisons, especially on the West Coast, when they were still territories, the first prisons were privately run. They were still territories. There really wasn't a state, and you had literally, in a lot of cases, business owners saying, "Hey, we'll take over the prisoners. You just give us the prisoners. We'll house them, but just got to let us work them for free." And pretty much by the time a lot of these territories became prisons, they specifically outlawed private prisons because the experiments turned out so badly. Typically, the prisoners were literally being worked to death. And then you kind of fast forward a little bit further. We have the Civil War. You have the emancipation of African American slaves, and then you go back to a lot of the newly freed slaves are then wind up in the criminal justice system. And at that time, it was kind of a mix between state-run prison systems that used the convict leasing system, where again they rented out the prison labor to companies. In fact, it was prison slave labor that built the railroads in most of what's now the South and the beginning of our highway system in these parts of the South. And that pretty much continued until after World War I, when basically there was just a series of scandals, and there was the movie, one of the early movies, I Escaped from a Chain Gang, and you mentioned earlier that you had a background in music, so Leadbelly, and a lot of blues musicians they literally honed their singing skills on these chain gangs. Elvis Presley's father was a prisoner at the penitentiary in Parchman, for example. And this is the stuff that kind of led to a backlash against private prisons. And so by the mid-1920s, that was it for private prisons. The American public had enough. They'd had enough of the brutality, the corruption, the sleaze that goes with it. And I think it's also worth noting is it wasn't just the brutality and the corruption, but like 40 to 50% of the prisoners did not survive to see the end of their sentence. That was the mortality rate.
Wow.
That they had at that point. And especially after the movie came out, I Escaped from a Chain Gang, that was pretty much it. In a wave of reform, the American public said we've had enough, and that was pretty much it for private prisons. And you kind of think that like a lot of bad ideas that we've experimented with, that, hey, that was the end of it. And unfortunately, you fast forward to the early 1980s, and you've got two guys, Dr. Krantz, and that's his name, Doctor, And
It's not actually a doctor.
no, he's not actually a doctor. He's no more a doctor than we are. But
His mama named him a doctor.
yeah,
I feel that should
Like
be
Dr.
like
Dre.
some sort of legal fraud to name your child doctor.
Yeah, right?
and they came up with the idea of, hey, the Reagan administration was in full swing, and they came up with the idea of, hey, if we privatize, if we do private prisons, we can we can make some money off of incarcerating people. And that's kind of where it started, and this modern era. And the big lie that they've foisted on people is the notion that somehow they can run prisons cheaper and better than the government, which they've never actually been able to show that.
Right.
But what they have been able to show, though, is that they can make a buck for their shareholders and their investors.
Right. Which just, again, seems fundamentally wrong.
Right.
And I would agree, it is.
Yeah. And so I guess my question is there a way to stop it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the government that makes the decisions to contract this stuff out. The politicians are the ones that make the decisions to send prisoners to these companies. And one of the things that we see, though, is that basically the private prison industry is fairly small. They've not been able to grow beyond, right now, they're like $3 billion a year as far as their combined gross revenues. And to put this into perspective, the California prison system alone is $11 billion. So the entire private prison industry in the United States combined is less than a third the size of California.
California is also a tricky spot to use because California is the world's 6th largest economy. Just
Right.
on its own, not even part of the United States, the world's 6th largest economy.
Right.
So it's a difficult. I always say because when people like to compare California, I'm like, wait a minute. California is like its own thing, kind of like New York's its own thing. Yeah.
Well, we can also put this in the context. The Florida prison system is around $2 billion a year in revenues and 97,000 prisoners. The entire private prison industry, including immigration detention, is around 125,000 prisoners.
Is immigration detention part of the private?
Oh yes.
Yeah,
oh yes.
absolutely.
GEO Group, which is the largest, right? Private.
They go back and forth depending
between
on who's got the contract.
CCA is now called Core Civic,
Core
isn't
Civic,
it? But yeah.
Okay.
And Geo used
Really?
to be known as Whack and Hut.
Correct.
Oh,
Correct.
really?
Yeah.
The Whack and Hut castle's down over here in Gables by the Sea.
Well, the GEO
Built a
runs
castle.
quite a few of these GEO major immigration detention centers, including the one up in Pompano Beach.
Really?
A lot of problems there. BTC, the Broward Transitional Center, that's a GEO Group facility.
So they do handle a lot of the. That. I mean, I guess my question there is that wrong?
Well, I think it is, because I think that you've got companies that are literally profiting off of human captivity and human misery, and it's also one of those things is the way they make money. And literally the way they make money is they cut corners as far as the prisoners go. But where they really make the money is on short staffing the facilities and using a non-union workforce.
Right.
And that's the thing, because 85% of the cost associated with caging people is paying the staff to do the caging.
Right.
Right. And there are a lot of complaints about involuntary labor, especially in the immigration detention centers where they're having these, detainees work instead of hiring janitors, et cetera. And I've seen them working.
And this is something Geo specifically has been sued numerous times over this.
Oh, they have?
Yeah,
There's several suits pending right now.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's essentially slave labor.
Right.
Absolutely.
Effectively, they're being. The suits allege that they are the detainees are being forced to work for basic stuff like food, toiletries,
and they pay them nominally $1 a day for their work.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's pretty
Now,
bad.
I have a question also because I've heard stories about larger prisons actually having their convicts or their caged people. I like the way you put that because that's really what it is. Do work for big companies.
Yeah, and that we've broken a lot of stories on that, and that's the numbers aren't really huge on any given day. There's around 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners nationally working for private companies.
How many?
5,000 to 6,000 out of 2.5 million prisoners.
Okay.
So the numbers themselves aren't huge. That said, it's also a good media story when you can run something that prisoners are packaging stuff for Nintendo or Starbucks or making stuff for Boeing, things like that. So
I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing for people to to work. I just think that, I guess
It's the who's benefiting from it is the question.
it's the who's benefiting.
Amen.
And I mean, it's okay if somebody benefits, but as long as that person that's doing the work maybe gets compensated kind of fairly. And that's what the stories I've heard, that it's like pennies a day.
That's the whole thing. Basically, I don't think anyone is opposed to the idea of prisoners working. At Human Rights Defense Center, our specific thing, though, is that we believe that prisoners need to be fairly compensated for their work. And a big thing that we have to remember, too, is that prisoners need to be paid a prevailing wage and also keep it, because otherwise what it does is it undermines wages in the outside community as well. Here in Florida, there's been a lot of stuff, especially after hurricanes, where it just sickens me when I see these politicians bragging, especially like here in Miami, that, oh, we use convict slave labor and they hauled away all this debris and rubbish, and otherwise we'd have had to spend $3 million or whatever those numbers are. And you think about it, no, that's $3 million that would have gone in wages to working people in our community.
Exactly.
That would have helped rebuild our community, and instead they're bragging about the enslavement of prisoners where they're not paying them anything. And I think that's one of the things that often gets overlooked is when you talk to some people and they think, oh, prison slavery is good because,
Who says that? I've never heard anybody say that.
There isn't a single person in elected office in this country that is opposed to prison slavery.
Really?
Nope.
That sounds awful. I mean, just even saying the sentence prison slavery sounds awful.
Well, part of the problem is the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, because I think a lot of people are misinformed and think that after the Civil War ended, that slavery was ended in the United States, and it wasn't ended. It was basically limited to people that have been convicted of a crime. And this is why, when I mentioned earlier about after the Civil War, when we had a lot of newly freed slaves finding themselves in prison and in jail and such, that was kind of the direct outgrowth of the 13th Amendment. It's like, okay, we can't just enslave people based on the color of their skin, so now we're going to enslave them based on the fact that they've been convicted of something.
Right.
And that was what kind of drove a lot of the incarceration in the South after the Civil War.
So one of the things that really threw me was I was listening to an NPR story, and this was about private prisons in Oklahoma. And one of the things that really, I was like, seriously? They said, oh, well, the contract with the private prison and the state requires that the beds stay 90% full. So, I mean, that means you have to be finding people, convicting them of crimes, even if you...
Well, there's a really interesting case going on right now in the Glades County Detention Center up by Lake Okeechobee.
Moorhaven. Mm-hmm.
Where effectively they were close to shutting the facility down. I guess I should back up. The county up there basically created what is effectively a private company. They created a nonprofit to solicit bonds from like Wall Street investors to open this prison and keep it open. And effectively the way they have maintained this facility is by shipping in federal, mostly ICE detainees from around the state and sometimes around the country. And they nearly, because right around the end of Barack Obama's tenure, he was a horrible deporter. Let's, don't get it mixed up, but he had
unmatched in history.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he had Obama deported tons of people.
Yeah. And so I don't want to lose that point, but he had at the end of his tenure kind of slowed his number of apprehensions down a little bit, and the Glades County Detention Center was close to closing because they weren't getting as many ICE detainees anymore. And this is something you can quite literally go back in the news clips and read, is that the sheriffs running the center were saying, oh, well, we need more detainees, and we need to find a way to bring more people into this jail facility, or we'll all lose our jobs. And fast forward 2 years, and there's, again, a news clip you can read from the local press up there that literally says business is booming for the Glades County Detention Center under Donald Trump.
Yes, sir. Well, I don't know if you also remember, during the very, very end of Obama's term, back at the end of 2016, he had ordered the Justice Department that they were going to phase out the BOP, the federal prison's use of private prisons. As soon as Trump took power, they reversed that.
Yeah.
A lot of Sessions' former aides are now lobbyists for GEO Group.
Jeff Sessions, the
Attorney General.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. And I think these private prisons have really benefited from these increased immigration detentions that we're seeing.
Yeah,
They're
I
making
think
a
the
lot of
stock
money.
prices went up.
Yeah.
A lot of money.
But that actually goes back to the Bill Clinton administration, and part of the thing is what you're talking about as far as like the occupancy thing, is it's what we've reported a lot of these contracts. We've got these contracts on our website, and basically what it is they get paid based on full occupancy. In other words, the prison can be empty, but the government's obligated to pay them based on at least 90% occupancy. And to an extent, I don't have a problem with that, because I think if you want to shuffle taxpayer money at these companies and they don't cage people, that's fine too. And let's take the misery and the suffering factor out and just make it a corruption boondoggle.
Right.
But this actually goes back to the late 90s. Basically, CCA and GEO were tanking due to their own corruption, mismanagement, everything else. Both companies were on the verge of being delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. Their stock was trading at like 19 cents a share, which when my colleagues and I discussed this, why didn't we buy their stock at that time? and I say, well, because we're not a bunch of capitalist pigs. But Bill Clinton and Congress were the ones that bailed them out with these sweetheart immigration contracts. And what these immigration contracts have is these just grossly inflated rates that these private prison companies are being paid to cage immigration detainees. So whereas the state of Mississippi is paying $27 or $29 a day to cage a convicted felon, ICE is paying GEO and CCA $162 a day to cage an immigration detainee. And
many times non-criminal, just
non-criminal defense, just whatever. And when you start thinking about it, I think you can stay at a pretty decent hotel with room service here in Miami in the off season for $162 a day. But there's no correlation between any of this stuff in terms of what their costs are or whatever. And the immigration contracts have really been what's floated the financial boat of the private prison industry for the past 20 years. Yes. And that's where they're making a disproportionate amount of their profits. But a lot of this has to do, though, with the whole way government procurement works. Because when earlier in the show we say that the government's the one that makes the decisions to do this, we've got a very perverse form of money laundering. And here's the difference. Jeff Sessions can go to Congress and tell them, hey, I need more money to lock people up for immigration or for prisons or whatever. But Jeff Sessions can't give politicians a bunch of money. And these private prison companies, they have lobbyists, they make campaign donations, and they spread the money evenly across the aisle. It doesn't matter. You can be a Democrat, you can be a Republican. If you can help them cage people and get paid to do so, they will pay you. And so you basically have the government contracts going to these companies who then turn around and recycle those taxpayer dollars into the form of campaign donations back to the politicians that are sending them the very contract. So you kind of got this sleazy cycle of money laundering with our taxpayer dollars that you don't see with government prisons. And I'm not here to be an apologist for the government prisons, because I'm not. But we do have to note, though, that the DOC secretary goes to the state legislature. He or she isn't there with a checkbook ready to dole out checks if they send him more prisoners.
So, just in your guys' experiences, besides the fundamental concept of private prison versus a state prison being what it is, are there any specifics or stories you've heard where you could point out, like, where something on the private prison side was maybe better than what was being done on the state side, or vice versa?
Sure.
Yeah, tell me.
I would say one of the good things about the fact that the private prison industry has a non-union workforce that's very low paid. They have very high turnover, so you don't have the violent gang culture among the guards. Tell
me about that. Tell me about violent gang culture among guards.
Well, this is endemic in state prisons and also in federal prisons. I mean, periodically in Prison Legal News, we'll run the stories about at the federal Supermax prisons in Colorado, there was a gang of guards. They called themselves the Cowboys, and they basically went around beating the crap out of prisoners they didn't like and covering it up. In some cases, falsifying criminal charges against the prisoners. And eventually, this kind of came undone. One of the guards blew the whistle on. Of course, no one above the rank of lieutenant got convicted. The buck stopped at the lieutenant, with the lieutenant, not the warden.
Right.
And, one of the more memorable lines that was recorded by the renegade guard that went undercover then was when the FBI is starting to question some of the prison guards. He asked the lieutenant, "What should I do?" And the lieutenant says, "Lie until you die."
Wow.
Wow.
Oh man.
But in a lot of prison systems, like here in Florida, for example, we have not too far from where we're recording this show, Darren Rainey was scalded to death by prison guards in his cell. He was literally burned to death, and and this is endemic. No one was fired. No one's been convicted. It took the medical examiner 4 years to even rule it was a homicide. And again, I think this is the thing. We're not comparing pristine apples with pristine oranges.
Right.
We're comparing a truckload of rotten, maggot-filled fruit, just with a different driver on the car.
Yeah, I mean, listen. There's no question that we need prisons and that there is crime out there, and we need a system to process it. I guess at the end of the day, it's how we as a community process those, our neighbors that are, because sometimes it can just be somebody that, like you said, they're in the detention center. They didn't even commit a crime. They're in the detention center, or maybe it was a young guy that did something stupid. And because young guys tend to do stupid
or you've been
stuff.
picked up for swerving in and out of a traffic lane, and you had an immigration detainer. It's,
Yeah. So, but to me, it's also what happens during this process that when they get out, what happens. We know that we have high recidivism rates here. We know that it's more of a punishment system than it is a reform system. Is there a plus to the private systems Yeah, Kristy, you were shaking your head before, too.
My experience with these privately owned prisons has been very negative.
Right.
I visited quite a few of the facilities, both on the immigration side as well as federal prisons. One of them being D. Ray James up in Folkestone, Georgia, is a major place where a lot of prisoners convicted in the Southern District of Florida are transferred to. And I've just heard all kinds of stories, and
Wait, prisoners that are convicted in Florida go.
Oh well, if you're convicted of a federal crime, you are right. I'm talking about federal prisons.
Okay.
You can be transferred anywhere in the country,
okay.
depending on your security level, but a lot of them end up there because that is what they call a criminal alien requirement prison. So these are all federal prisoners with immigration detainers on them, and the facility is just awful. I hear all kinds of stories, and I've been up there, and even though they're supposed to be adhering to federal standards, a lot of them don't, and there's not a lot of oversight.
Yeah, because you hear, the federal prison. If you're gonna do a crime, do a federal crime, because it's like it's
the federal prison camp here in Florida.
Right.
Yeah, everybody wants to be there,
Yeah.
but I've just had some awful experiences. I've had clients that have been abused by guards. I had one client who miscarried. I've had clients whose medical needs were not attended to, and that does happen in the BOP, run prisons. But I just feel like it's a lot more prevalent in these private prisons.
Yeah.
Because again, they're there to make a profit, and I feel like that is the.
And they're understaffed, and
Exactly.
Yeah, because you just made a comment about something in the medical, because that's also a big issue.
Medical care is horrific for state, federal, and private prisons, and
It
especially one of the big things that we've seen too is when people generally don't think about them as private prison companies, but we have a lot of companies that basically they let the state privatize their entire medical care system. That's both at the jail level and the DOC level, and basically these are like the HMOs from hell. And they have a real simple business model, which is the same business model that GO and CCA have, which is basically you get as much taxpayer money as you can and you provide as little service as possible. And that manifests itself in lack of staffing, and then, heaven forbid, anyone should get any type of serious or chronic illness, because more likely than not they're going to die. Around 2 years ago, the Palm Beach Post did a really good series, which we reprinted, about the privatization of healthcare here in Florida by the DOC. And before the health system was privatized, an average of 35 to 40 prisoners a year died for medical reasons in the Florida DOC. And that had been a pretty stable number for a decade. Wow. And 35 to 40, if you go to a prison population of 100,000. Within a year of it being privatized and taken over by Horizon, those deaths went from 35 to 40 a year to 400 to 500 a year. So you've got like literally 0.5% of the prison population is dying of medical neglect every year. Those numbers have held steady. And I was just reading a news report a couple of months ago when the latest round of stats came out, and the person writing it observes, wow, prisoners seem to be dying younger and healthier than ever before. And it's like, but this is because, we don't have, these aren't situations where prisoners are dying of exotic diseases or, bizarre things that are unknown to science. We've got people that are dying, diabetics are dying because they don't have insulin. Mm-hmm. People are dying from hypertension because they're not getting pills that cost 5 cents a day.
Hepatitis.
Mm-hmm.
To administer.
And fungal infections and all kinds of things because of the lack of hygiene. I mean, they are notoriously dirty places.
Well, yeah, I imagine they must be. But wouldn't you think that people that work in the healthcare sector, I mean, a lot of those people, they kind of have a calling. I mean, you don't necessarily go into that business to get
it's like
rich.
The doctors that worked at Dachau and Auschwitz. That's pretty much the same thing. Right now, the Human Rights Defense Center, we're about to file a lawsuit. In fact, this morning, when I was scheduling the show, I had to schedule a meeting with the family of a prisoner. We're about to file a lawsuit next week or the following week. Our client, his name is Vincent Gaines. He starved to death in the Florida DOC. He went into prison weighing 190 pounds. By the time he left in a body bag 7 months later, he weighed 110 pounds. He starved to death. And this is the thing is, we're not talking about, and I read prison stuff from around the world. I mean, if there's anything happening in a prison, at some point it flashes across someone's computer screen at HRDC and the more interesting stuff gets forwarded to me. And when I read about in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 100 prisoners starved to death because, I think the warden there would say, hey, we're a poor country. The government isn't giving me the means to feed the prisoners and their families are too poor to feed them too. So, yeah, I guess people starve to death. But we're not the Democratic Republic of the Congo. No. We're not Haiti.
Right.
And this is happening at Rayford here in Florida on a prison system spending that has over $2 billion a year. And just like Darren Rainey was scalded and burned to death by the guards, our client was literally starved to death by the people in his custody that had a constitutional duty to safeguard them. And to me, the thing is, the differences in some respects, I think this is even worse, is when you can think about cases like Darren Rainey. And are you guys old enough to remember Frank Valdez? He was a prisoner on death row here in Florida in 96 or 97. He was on death row for killing a prison guard, and a gang of prison guards beat him to death. And they didn't just beat him to death like, hey, things got a little out of hand, but every single one of his ribs was broken, his testicles were crushed, he had boot prints on his face, beat to death. Wow. And ultimately, the 6 guards were charged with his murder. A jury acquitted all 6 of them of second-degree murder charges. So this is kind of like the system we're talking about here in Florida. It's an uninterrupted line of brutality and cruelty. But unlike those cases, like Frank Valdez getting beat to death, which happened in probably less than an hour or two, unlike Darren Rainey being burned to death, which I think the medical examiner said it would have taken around an hour and a half at scalding temperatures for the skin to peel, for the meat to start falling off his bones, and for his skin to start sliding off. Our client was starved to death, and having reported a lot on hunger strikes, going back to Bobby Sands and that, we know that for fit young men, it takes 45 to 60 days before you die from malnutrition. That's when you're making the conscious effort of, refusing all food, right, just drinking water. It's well documented how long it takes men in captivity to starve to death.
Right.
So that's what happened to our client. And he was a mentally ill African-American man in his 50s. They knew he had mental health problems, and he starved to death.
Which leads me to ask the next question, mental health. Because it doesn't seem that the prison systems are necessarily equipped to cope and deal with mental health, yet it seems that probably a good amount of people that are incarcerated have mental health issues. I mean, is that
Depending on who's doing the counting and how it's being figured, depending on the state, 40 to 60% of prisoners are judged to be seriously mentally ill. And that's in the context of Axis 1 or Axis 2 disorders. This isn't just, hey, Johnny's got some issues. This is, no, serious paranoia, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder.
right?
You name it. And personally, I think those numbers are low. I think they're underreported because people in prison generally don't have a lot of incentive to self-report as being mentally ill or mentally disabled.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to ask you a question real quick, Jerry, about you do a lot of reporting on corruption. So I'm just curious if you hear a lot, because that's a huge number, 50% of the population being having mental health issues. I mean, there's got to be a lot of corrupt stuff happening in the system. Do you have any input on that stuff, or?
In terms of corruption, I'm sure anyone can rattle off, tiny specific stories, but I frankly, I don't think that is necessarily the problem as much as, having sort of a long-standing system that is just societally, as a country, we don't talk about mental health issues. We don't discuss them. We don't have a insurance system or care system in place where poor people are able to get care. And then we have, on top of that, a criminal justice system that has criminalized, most basic, if you're, say, in the street and suffering from serious mental crisis, what are you going to do? You're going to be screaming sometimes. You're going to be, talking to strangers and saying, acting erratic. Yeah. And those things are criminalized. And, you can talk about corruption in that in that context, but frankly, you can rid the system of any corruption you want. It's, it's still going to express itself that way because that's the way the society is sort of designed.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I was going to say, but we do have plenty.
Oh
of
yeah,
corruption.
I'm not denying there isn't. But.
Yeah,
there is.
Let's not forget that James Crosby, the former Department of Corrections Secretary in 2006 or 2005, was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for taking kickbacks from the canteen vendors here in Florida.
Crazy.
And the part that gets me though is, so he went to prison for taking the bribes, but the companies all still kept the contracts that they paid him the bribes to do. And I think when all was said and done, like 30 or 40 FDOC senior officials went to prison on corruption charges. And recently, Chris Epps, the Mississippi DOC director, he got sentenced to 26 years in federal prison when basically he put the entire state prison system up for sale. Everyone was paying him kickbacks, from the telephone vendors to the private prison companies, the company that sold urine cups for urine testing. Everyone was giving him a kickback.
Incredible.
And I think this is actually really endemic. And
was he running a private prison or a state prison?
No, he was the DOC director for the state of
Department of
Mississippi.
Corrections director.
Yeah, and every vendor that was doing business with the Mississippi Department of Corrections was paying tribute to Charles Epps. And I think that what's really critical about this is the lack of oversight and lack of transparency that facilitates and encourages the brutality, the mistreatment, the killings that happen in prisoners. This is a prime environment for corruption as well.
Listen, I mean, the whole concept of prison, I think, just for the general public is, okay, we don't want to know what you do over there. Just go take the bad people,
Sight unseen.
Put them over there, and we just deal with them. We don't want to know. Because, I mean, I'm guilty of that. Until I started doing this show and or a conversation here or there, or I read a story or hear a story and say, hey, that seems kind of screwy. I don't think that's right. But the reality of it is, it's like death. People don't like to plan for their dying day. It's coming, but people don't want to plan for it. And this prisons are the same way. It's like, hey, I want my streets safe. I want my school safe. So you take the bad people and put them away, and what you do with them, I don't care. Problem is that I see now, it does have a big effect on our community. And when I say our community, I mean the whole country, but I'm just working from this community. I see how it affects my community.
But I think that's one of those things. It's one thing to ask people what their views are on crime and punishment, and hey, what do you think should happen to people that are accused of a crime or convicted of a crime? But I think most people as taxpayers I don't think most of us really like the idea of some guy that we're paying $200,000 to be the head of a government agency pocketing millions of dollars in bribes
No doubt.
to sell out his government office.
No doubt.
And even if you're okay with the idea of, prisoners being locked up or even
treated harshly
treated
or
harshly.
having to work or labor. Yeah.
Right, but the idea that the DOC director is using his government job to line his pockets at taxpayer expense,
Yeah.
I don't know there's too many people that...
No, it's a scumbag move for sure.
Yeah, I don't think too many people are going to say, yeah,
It's
I'm down with
definitely,
that.
yeah. It's like, come on. Yeah.
But to me, it seems like those are almost two separate questions of, how much do you tolerate? And I don't deny that, it's a system that engenders corruption because you create a class of people that are basically ignored. And then,
Exactly.
But at the same time, I think it still is sort of two different questions of, and I don't think anyone would disagree with
Yeah,
me,
no,
of,
we don't,
what do you do from a punishment standpoint, and then B, how much corruption do you tolerate in the system, et cetera.
Right.
And, something I wanted to get back to that you said early on, I think almost in the intro even, was just the idea that, nobody, it was, if I'm quoting you correctly, nobody denies the idea that we need prisons. But, I mean, there's a gigantic decarceration movement, which I'm sure you all discussed ad nauseum on this podcast. And if you're talking private prisons, it's just a system that is intentionally designed to,
Cage people.
yeah, well,
And perpetuate.
That's what I'm looking for. Is
Mhm.
perpetuate
Yeah.
the carceral system. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's awful. It's awful. It encourages, somewhere along the line, I would assume that judges must be influenced somehow because they're the ones
Their jobs
handing down the
depend on
sentence.
it.
Some of them are.
But a judge, listen, a judge could sit in their chambers, all day doing a crossword puzzle and probably still get paid if they had 2 cases a week.
But the problem is that, like a lot of the things that we see, especially like here in Florida and other parts of the country, is the judges are imposing fees on criminal defendants, and then their salary depends on how many fees they impose on people. So they've actually got a vested
Really?
financial interest in terms of how many people they're processing and how many people they're loading up with fees and
Wait
fines.
a minute. You're saying that there's a direct connection?
Yes.
How's that possible?
The fees that they routinely assess on criminal defendants here in Florida, Louisiana, and a bunch of other states go to pay the judges' salaries, also the prosecutors and the public defenders as well. So the only people that aren't getting a part of this action is the private criminal defense bar. But and this goes back to one of the things that I think that one of the seismic shifts that's happened, I think, in our lifetime is when I started Prison Legal News in 1990, we had 1 million people locked up. So it took the United States from 1776 to 1990 to lock up the first 1 million people. Then between 1990 and 2000, we locked up another 1 million. So it took us over 200 years to lock up the first 1 million. Then it took us 10 years to lock up the second 1 million.
That's a lot of people being locked up in 10 years.
When-
Are those the right numbers?
Yes, those are the right numbers. I lived it. And I was reporting on one of the things where this kind of really came up for me, and it sounds really silly, but as Prison Legal News was growing, we started out as a newsletter focused on Washington State, and then for various reasons we expanded nationally. Prisoners around the country started subscribing to us, so our readership grew, and by the mid '90s we had a database program in Access where we're tracking everything. And the United States, we're opening up like 1 and 2,000 bed prisons every week or every 2 weeks for 10 years. And so we saw our database when we started out, I think in the 90s, in the first 10 years that we were in business as a publication, we added around 900 new prison addresses into our database.
Wow.
And it got to the point where when we first started when we first came up with our database program, the programmers so how big of a deal is it to add new addresses? And I was naive at the time, saying, well, gosh, they don't open up that many prisons, so it's okay if you do it. And then it got to the point where we're bugging him every month. We had 3 or 4 requests, and he's like, okay, I'm going to rewrite this so you guys can add the addresses. And then we had literally a routine so that as we're getting subscriptions from these new prisons, we had to streamline a process to expand our database.
Wow.
And I think what you just described is, why it's so important when you see so many of these activists on the ground. Obviously there's, always been anti-prison activism, but, you're seeing this sort of renewed kind of groundswell of it right now, is that when you open a new facility, any new wing of this where money starts going, where people start getting hired, where, especially where, union workers are working, shutting those things down then becomes almost impossible.
Right.
And it's not impossible, but it's remarkably difficult.
I get that,
Yeah.
because now you're starting to take jobs away from a community, and
The irony is it's easier to shut down private prisons. They lose a contract, they shutter that place and mothball until they get the next contract. But these government prisons, it's ironic because, as Jerry was saying, and you go to New York and Illinois, they've depopulated these prisons and they're fully staffed. You've got like 300 guards and 6 prisoners sweeping the floors. But no one, and that's part of the thing about using prisons as trying to use prisons as engines of economic development, or as we like to say, welfare for poor rural white communities.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm just sitting here wondering, is there another use for these places?
They need to be bulldozed.
Really?
Part of the thing is that, is everyone familiar with the Maginot Line? So before World War II, the French built this elaborate line of concrete and steel bunkers and fortifications to keep the Nazis from invading France. Well, the Germans just went around it and invaded France anyways. But for its day, that was one of the biggest public works project in European history. And the French sunk, billions of francs into the ground, into these massive fortifications. But then it's like, okay, the war's over. No one's going to invade France anytime soon. What do we do with it? It's just rotting in the ground. And that's the same thing with prisons. They've come up with this thing about, how do we repurpose prisons? First off, they've built them in these remote rural places, which to paraphrase or to quote our beloved president are shitholes. Yeah. And these places were in economic trouble because there's no economic activity there. The prison doesn't resuscitate that. Right. Ironically, the places that the prisons were in good places, like there was the Riverside prison in New Jersey, which was on prime real estate territory. They spent like $200 million building this prison complex in the 90s. The real estate developers wanted it, and they got it. They shut down the prison. The bulldozers came in. The prison is gone. Now it's condos and a shopping mall and stuff like that. But the problem with the prisons is you can't really repurpose them. This is almost the same market. I spoke late last year. The American Academy of Architecture has a criminal justice group, and these are the architects that design prisons and jails. And I was one of their speakers, and it was a really interesting encounter for me because I think I'm fairly well informed on criminal justice issues, and anytime I can learn something new, it's pretty good. And I was talking to these architects and specifically about that. Okay, you guys build these prisons, right? So what can you do with them if you shut them down? If you don't do anything with them? And they're all like, you pretty much got to bulldoze them. There's really when we're designing these prisons, there really isn't anything else you can do with them. Nothing else to do with them. You're not going to turn them into a college. You're not going to turn them into therapeutic centers.
They've tried that.
Yeah, with dismal results.
Yeah. Kristy, I'm just curious your point of view on you practiced in all 50 states.
Well, yes, immigration law. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I've also practiced, in federal courts across the country. But yes, I've had.
I'm curious to know some of your horror stories and which state is the most horrific.
Well, this is really the private prisons and the BOP facilities in other states. I've just really had more horror stories from the private prisons than the BOP facilities. And again, I had a client that, was bleeding and she was pregnant. She wasn't attended to. She miscarried. I've heard stories of people being sexually abused by the guards. I've heard stories of rats running around in the kitchen. All kinds of things.
Yeah, not pleasant.
Yeah.
But so out of all 50 states, which one?
Well, I think that the
As-
facilities
wait,
in
which one
Florida
has
and
most
Georgia,
race to the bottom?
Which one is the shithole?
a lot of the facilities in Georgia tend to be pretty bad.
Really?
I don't know why, but I hear a lot of stories out of Georgia. Maybe it's because I've had a lot of clients detained in the state of Georgia, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's all across the country.
Yeah, and I always say this, you know, people don't get involved in these things until it affects them personally. So, you know, if you're listening to this show and you've gone through it, you know. But if you've never gone through it and you've never seen one of these places, I always encourage people, you know, get involved now, because if something does happen to somebody you know or to you, well, you should be a lot further ahead of the game if you know something, because it's a scary place to be out there in any of these prisons, but particularly in the states that seem to have more of these private prisons that seem to want to arrest people and convict people because they have to meet these quotas.
Yeah, I think one of the things, too, that we shouldn't overlook, I think one of the things is when you look at other, you know, when you look at the phenomenon of mass incarceration, you think, okay, we're talking about people committing criminal offenses and getting arrested. One of the things that I think is the beauty of the American system of mass incarceration is that we're not waiting for people to commit crimes. On any given day to day, right now, as we're sitting here recording this show, around 50,000 Americans are locked up because they're too poor to pay child support. Yep. They haven't been accused of a criminal offense. They haven't been charged with a criminal offense. Right. They're just too poor to pay child support. In most parts of the world, having children isn't necessarily viewed as something that's going to get you locked up.
Right.
And then we've got this whole system of fines, for example, that quickly bleeds over into incarceration, where there's an ordinance that says that you have to mow your lawn. Well, you're disabled and you can't mow your lawn and you can't pay someone to do it. Well, now you're being fined. Well, because you're poor, you can't pay the fine. Now you're going to jail. And again, no one's been accused of a crime here in the traditional sense. And I think we know that there's two types of crimes. There's the ones that are crimes because they're wrong. And, you know, any society that you go throughout recorded human history, murder is wrong, rape is wrong, robbery is wrong. There's no dispute about that. And I don't think you're going to find anyone that says, hey, yeah, it's okay to kill people. And then we've got the stuff that's a crime because the government says so.
And how many people do you say are locked up because of that?
Just on the child support, we did an article, and part of what got me thinking about this is we sue a lot of jails around First Amendment issues. And I was looking at the roster for a jail in South Carolina that we were suing, and it was like a 400 or 500 bed jail, and I keep seeing, and you know, the charge that they were incarcerated for was failure to pay child support. And there's like literally page after page.
Which is counterintuitive to put the person that needs to go earn the money in jail where they can't earn any money.
And there are also the poor defendants that, you know, are locked up pre-trial just because they can't make cash bail.
Exactly.
And that's a huge problem.
Huge problem. Yeah, we've had all over the country. We did an entire episode on the bail bond system, and it's also seems like one of these self-feeding systems where you have the insurance companies on the corporate side, you know, being fed the fees that the bail bondsmen are putting up, that the people are paying their 10% if they can. And I mean, listen, I think that the whole money bail system is crazy. It is crazy, and we're one of the very few countries in the world that even does that. So,
and on the immigration side, you have a lot of companies that have come in and they help you if you don't have property to put up. And a lot of these immigrants, you know, they're new to this country. They don't have that.
Exactly.
And so, you know, they tell you, okay, well, you know, instead of putting up 10%, you're going to put up 30%, but you don't have a house, no problem. And then you get out. They're like, okay, let me slap on an ankle monitor, a private company slapping on an ankle monitor, and you have to pay $800 a month.
Or you go back
or you forfeit your bail.
Geo bought one of the ankle monitor companies.
It's maddening.
It is maddening.
Expanding.
There was a Congressman Carlos Curbelo, it was a story we wrote not long ago. I want to say it was roughly a year ago now. There's a group called, one of the groups, Libre by Nexus.
Libre by Nexus. Notorious, yes.
And Curbelo was hosting a talk, just a happy-go-lucky panel discussion, you know, alongside these Libre people who are just transparently profiting off of this system.
Wow.
We reached out to him, and I was like, hey, you know, this company is, you know, here's like, you know, 900 different stories of immigrants complaining that they're being, you know, fleeced by this company. And magically he hours after we contacted him, said he was no longer appearing. But these companies insinuate themselves into the political system, and that is again why I just feel like the activism on these issues is so important, because you can't really let up for a second, because these companies are just dying to just infect the political system.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think the part of the thing is, that when we talk
point.
about the laundering of the government money, it's like, Marco Rubio gets, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year from Geo. George Zoli, the president of Geo Corporation, he's hosting fundraisers in his mansion in Boca for the governor.
Yeah.
And, and you see this pattern play itself out around the country. And it goes regardless of political party. It's not, we're not going to just say that it's just a Republican problem.
Right. So how do we, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if this is such a systemic problem and we want to make a change, is it based just on voting? Yes, voting is very important. People, you should all vote. But if you're telling me it's on both sides and that whoever's going into that, they're going to be approached and attacked, I mean, I don't know.
The problem is, what this gets to the fundamental problem with the American prison system is that we don't have candidates. It's not so much the voting, because I look at this as someone who has an interest. I guess I'm a single issue voter too, but so my single issue that I look for some of my issues that I look for when I'm voting for candidates are what's their stance on the death penalty. And just right off the bat, I'm not talking crazy like, hey, people in prison should get adequate medical care, they shouldn't be enslaved.
Right.
Let's just start off something really basic. The government shouldn't be in the business of killing its citizens.
Right.
And I think that's a real bottom line thing. So when I'm going in at like statewide election, I'm not sure that I have any statewide candidates that are opposed to the death penalty in Florida.
Right.
I lived in Vermont for 10 years, and Bernie Sanders didn't come out against the death penalty until he was running for president. For 20 plus years or 30 years in Congress, he voted for every death penalty bill that came his way. Yeah. He voted for every tough on crime bill that came along.
Yeah, I mean, I think because the small-mindedness of the community and the electorate, again, is I want to be safe. And it seems that almost every politician always runs on, well, I'll be tough on crime.
Right.
They all run on that.
Right. I think you counter that by saying that none of this has any actual correlation with basic public safety for the most part.
Exactly.
Yes. I 100% agree with that. But
I think they look for a way to weaponize fear in people.
Well, yeah, that's for sure.
And it's just sort of, I feel like, people who are accused of or convicted of crimes are an easy target,
Yeah. Also because they make the rest of us feel fear. And that's been programmed into us. If somebody's a former prisoner, and you hear that, this guy was in prison before, you're like, oh, wait a minute, let me check my wallet, make sure this guy doesn't just keep my wife and kids away from here. But that's not necessarily true. And we know that because I know plenty of people who have gone to prison who are good people, and they got caught up in a bad situation, but they're good people. But we, in general, don't process the information that way. The same way the court of public opinion doesn't process people are innocent until proven guilty. I don't know who we can blame that on. TV, the media, politicians, I don't know. But it seems to me that most of the time, somebody gets arrested, you see them in handcuffs, you're like, that guilty son of a bitch.
I think it's human nature.
But I also think, too, a lot of it has to do with humanizing people. And I think there's a huge amount of effort that goes into dehumanizing not just, I don't think this applies just in the criminal justice context. I think it applies to foreign policy issues. We see this, I think, whether it's immigration or whoever. As long as you're doing horrible stuff to other people or people that you don't actually know who they are. I think one of the things I look at is that one of the big triumphs, I think one of the modern civil rights triumphs in my lifetime has been that of the gay rights movement.
Yeah, huge.
And I think, when I was born, being gay was a criminal offense. Gay sex was a criminal offense in lots of places. It was a mental disorder, according to the American Psychiatric Society. And I think that one of the things that really changed that was, I forget which U.S. Supreme Court justice it was that voted in upholding Georgia's sodomy law. But he said, someone asked him, how could you vote for this law? And he's like, well, there aren't that many homosexuals. I don't know any. And it was like, well, no, actually, you knew a lot. They just weren't out of the closet about it. And that's been one of the things that I think that one of the things that happened is that as gay people became more visible in our society, the bigotry and discrimination is not just like, who is this mythical homosexual, but then it's like, well, wait, no, actually it's my uncle or it's my neighbor.
Right. Humanize them.
My kid, my child is gay.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, and I think that's one of the things that, especially for most people, it's like, whatever your circle of friends and family is, we're most concerned about our children.
Yeah, and I'm going to go right back to the beginning of this show when Kristy said it's about white privilege because,
yes, sir.
Listen, transgender people would not be getting the respect they get if it wasn't because there was a white dude, Bruce Jenner, who wanted to become a white chick. Mm-hmm. That's a fact. I mean, and that's white privilege right there in front of you. It's not because of something else. It's because a white dude wanted to do it.
Well, but at the end of the day, it's a good thing that
It
I
is
think
a
that
good
there's
thing,
more
yeah.
trans visibility. I'll use the example of Congresswoman Ros Lehtinen, who has a transgender son.
Exactly.
And she's changed so much.
Yeah, of course. And no, it's plenty
for the
of,
better.
Yeah, plenty of politicians that all of a sudden they're against it. Oh, what? My son is gay? You know what? My son's not such a bad guy. It's not so bad to be gay. And you're right. It is the uncle or the friend and you realize, wait, this person I like this person. Okay, so who cares who you sleep with?
Yeah. And then of course, speaking of Bruce Jenner, the woman he killed in the traffic accident, that negligent homicide investigation doesn't seem to be going anywhere either.
Nothing happened to that, right?
No. I mean, I've been waiting. We like to report on the criminal justice system for the rich and famous, and
it's a whole different system,
or a
The
non-existent
OJ effect.
system.
Yeah. I mean, these things affect these things called money. They seem to affect based on the conversations I've had with experts in their fields, such as yourself. It seems that way because go ahead.
Just to get back to I don't think you guys would disagree with me. I mean, I think the difference in terms of maybe the gay and LGBTQ plus and trans rights movements versus say a mass decarceration movement is just the structural just amount of money that is poured into the criminal justice system as it stands and poured into the political system by private enterprises profiting off the criminal justice system is utterly massive in scale compared to those movements.
No, it's a criminal and industrial complex.
Yeah. And something you're seeing right now is group the Dream Defenders, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. I accompanied them a few weeks ago to the Leadership Blue Gala, which is the Florida Democratic Party's yearly fundraising soiree. I was at the it was just utterly unbearable, but it was at the just a lot of people.
Had a good time, huh?
Yeah. Now I've written that in the past, so nobody'd be surprised. But the Dream Defenders showed up on the last day to propose basically an ordinance getting the Florida Democratic Party to ban donations from private prisons at the state level. And you would think, it had absolute majority support in that room, but there was a small minority of people who were,
Hey, that's our money.
yeah, sort of closer to the, say, center of the political spectrum, quote unquote, which, in any civilized society means they're probably to the right of the actual general political spectrum, were opposed to it. And I later obtained internal emails from the party saying quite literally that, I'm worried we're not going to have enough money if we to beat Republicans if we stop taking money from Geo Group, for example. And
wow,
that is the basic question. And this is, guess what you were talking about how it crosses parties where, if we have this insane system of legal bribery, this is kind of how both parties are going to operate. Yeah. And thank God the measure at least passed. We don't see how people are going to try and finagle their way around it, but the measure passed at the Florida Democratic Party level, and then barely weeks later, the California Democratic Party followed suit, and they are also going to ban donations from private prison companies.
Nice.
Okay.
And if you're listening to this, want to reach out to the Dream Defenders to see how you can do it in your state. I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
But there is movement on the ground level to change at least structurally the way these parties are funding. At least one party, I should say, is funding itself, but it's the most uphill of uphill battles.
Yeah. So the first step in trying to reduce our prison population is probably going to be trying to get rid of these private prisons that are profiting from caging people up. And I guess the second step
I
is...
don't really think that really impacts anything.
You don't?
I think that,
Well,
private prisons, I think, are the symptom. Mass incarceration is the disease. It's the government that makes the decision on
Right.
caging people.
So then we have to pick who we vote for a little more carefully.
Among other things, but I mean, part of the thing, too, is that, one of the things that's really driven the size of the prison population in this country has been the length of the sentences, pretty much.
Mandatory minimums?
Not just mandatory minimums, just across the boards. Every year the legislature is creating dozens, if not hundreds, of new offenses. They're criminalizing new behavior, stuff that it wasn't even. When I started Prison Legal News in 1990, we started in May of 1990, the month before Washington created this country's first system of sex offender registration. So until then, this didn't even exist. If you were convicted of a sex offense, there was no, quote, registry. Now, on any given day, there's tens of thousands of people that are locked up in cages because they didn't comply with the bureaucratic requirement of registering for a registry, because 30 years ago it didn't exist. So, this is, when you start thinking about how legislatures create crimes where none exist, stop creating crime. That's one good thing. Decriminalize stuff that's been criminalized, and then shorten sentences. And that's one of the things that on any given day right now, we've got, I think it's over 200,000 prisoners in the country that are serving sentences of life without parole. Basically they've been sentenced to death by incarceration.
Right.
And then you've got the people that have what we call the Buck Rogers sentences. They may not formally be sentenced to life without parole, but if you're 50 years old and you get sentenced to 500 years in prison and you got to serve 80% of it, we can do the math.
Yeah.
So, and the thing was, 30 years ago, that was very uncommon. You didn't see that many people being sentenced to exceptional sentences like that. Prisoners that actually served more than, say, 20 years in prison up until, say, the 1960s. That was very, very much the exception. To talk to someone that was before, say, 1980, talking to someone that actually served more than 20 years in prison. The atom bomb spies, Morton Sobel, he was the guy that didn't get the death penalty with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. He did like 15 years in prison. Right. Loeb and Leopold at the time, the most sensational murder in American history. I think one of them got killed in prison, but the other guy got out after like 20 plus years.
Right. You used to see that.
This is how things have changed, and all for the bad. But for centuries in American society, people didn't get these massive sentences. We didn't criminalize everything. Right. And arguably America was a safer place.
And on the immigration side, these, detainees that are just waiting their deportation proceedings that have not been, sentenced to any time.
Well, it's not a crime. Let's not forget it's not a crime.
Right. It's civil. It's a civil proceeding.
Right.
I really advocate for alternatives to detention.
Yeah.
ICE has these programs, ADT, that are proven to be like 98% effective. These people show up to court.
Yeah,
and they're so much less expensive.
That's why they're here.
Exactly. When you talk about, they say it's $300 and something a day, some of these, the cost to detain these immigrants. Right. Whereas on ADT, alternatives to detention, it's $10 to $15 a day. It makes so much sense.
It makes a lot of sense. To me, the whole immigration issue is its own program because it's so complex. And personally, I have a lot of, I think a lot of Americans have a lot of feelings on this, probably both ways. But to me, I've always, one of the things I love about Miami is the cultural differences. I really love that about this city because I've lived in other places where it was super homogenous and it was incredibly boring. And the food was not good.
So it's a good eating town.
Yeah. But it seems to me that the whole American concept is this: send us your suffering, your huddled masses, your
in principle,
to be free.
In principle,
in
but
writing,
it's not
it
what
is.
we're seeing.
Well, no, it is. I know it's not what we're
seeing.
seeing, but it seems that's what I'm saying. Like for your expertise, I think there's a whole show there because, immigration is a hot topic, just like getting
has
this
been for
prison
100
this
for
over
prison
100
population,
years.
down. But we need immigration, or else who's going to pay my Social Security when I
Or who's going to pick
retire?
our vegetables?
That too.
Well,
Yeah.
and immigrants do a lot more than picking vegetables and
Yeah.
fruit and cleaning toilets.
Yeah.
We have engineers. We have,
of course. But I'm
People
saying
really
that I
contributing
need
to
those
this
people to be
company.
here to work and to grow
Absolutely.
this
And,
country. To,
Absolutely.
To get to what you were saying about the way domestic crime, we'll put it that way, has sort of escalated and been created effectively over the last. This is the same thing that underpins the sort of new kind of abolish ICE movement, which is that ICE didn't exist until 2003. It had a predecessor in INS, but then B, the number of deportable crimes was ratcheted up in 1996.
Right. Yes.
and-
So there have been a lot of changes
Yeah.
in the law and
Yeah.
offenses. I mean, the whole criminal immigration consequences of criminal activity is very complex because it involves a lot of statutory comparisons and it differs from circuit to circuit, federal circuit to federal circuit sometimes. But yeah, absolutely, there are people that were convicted pre-1996 that are able to seek certain types of waivers and stay in this country, whereas people who were convicted later in time are not. There's relief available to people, depending on when they were convicted, which is crazy.
It is crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys have been amazing. This has been a very, very cool show. I'd love to have you guys back again because this is a topic that I think could be, over
I'd love it.
3 shows. Yeah, you guys are okay. Before we wrap up, a lot of the people involved in producing this show have music backgrounds, so we like to ask what you guys are listening to musically this last couple weeks, this last month. Who you listening to? Who's on your playlist?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I got to pull out my phone. It's just, man. I'm listening to all kinds of music. I mean, everything from hip hop to,
Anybody in particular? Any artists in particular?
I really like Kendrick Lamar.
Okay.
I listen to him a lot. But yeah, no, I it really depends on the day.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to listen to just some really old jazz, and it just depends.
All right.
How about you?
Kendrick Lamar.
Same thing. I pretty much like. I like everything across genres. Everything from electronic.
Yeah.
You
Anybody in particular you're listening to?
I like everything from Kraftwerk to Roger Waters.
Oh wow,
I've
nice.
seen Roger Waters in concert every time I get the chance to. He puts on a phenomenal show. I think that it shows what artists can do.
Little Pink Floyd's. Vibe
I love me
there.
some Pink
man.
Floyd.
Yeah.
Love me
I
some
think in
Pink
terms
Floyd.
of like a multimedia artist, if you've been
Yeah.
to his shows, they're phenomenal.
Right.
And especially I think he's one of the few. I think a lot of the shows, not all of them, but a lot of shows, like he'll dedicate the show to the victims of state terrorism, which I think is very unusual among major artists.
Yeah.
And so I think there's I think that's also one of the things too is I think musicians have historically been I think sympathetic to the issues of criminal justice reform because so many of them have run-ins
With the law.
No
doubt.
Usually revolving around drugs and alcohol.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
How about
Yeah.
you, Jerry? Who you
I'm a
listen
big
to?
hip hop guy. To shout out some local Florida musicians, really into Denzel Curry lately. This musician called Princess Nokia is really cool.
From South Florida?
She's not. Denzel Curry is. But who else? Prince is my all-time favorite musician.
Yeah.
Prince?
So, yeah.
Nice.
Love me some Prince.
Looking forward to some
Yeah.
of that unreleased stuff coming out.
I'm actually not because it was kind of his thing to put the stuff in the vault and
Curate.
Not meant
yes.
to.
Yeah, so I'm a little.
He was a picky guy.
a little upset that they're just kind of opening that up
Yeah,
and dumping it all
well,
out there.
that's
But, yeah,
Someone's got to make money for the estate.
yeah,
yeah, that's how
How
that
about
works.
you?
yeah.
This last week, I've been on like a lot of the Latin stuff. I've been
tell me more,
grooving
tell
on
me
like a
more.
Latin. No, nothing necessarily new. Just some Mark Anthony.
Oh, okay.
And then I've also been I was grooving on the new Drake album and then some of this California hip hop. This Lil Xan. I was listening to his new thing. He's got some cool like doped out hip hop. Little trashy white kids. It's kind of interesting. His tattoos on the face, the whole
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, it's wild.
We've got some great local bands as well. Some
Yeah,
great
Miami's got a
groups.
ton of talent. We got a lot of
Yeah.
talent coming out of here. All right, for Felony Miami team and all our producers and our staff and our fans, I'm your host, Joe Stone. Don't forget to check us out online at felonymiami.com. Check out the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, your favorite RSS feeds. If you'd like to make some comments, email us. Hit the phone number at the bottom of the website. Leave a voicemail. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Well, it's early, and I wanna, baby, when I ride, Lordy mama.